Good evening, Erev Tov, and welcome to another session of the very popular Around the World with Fred. Before I do introductions and a little bit of promotion for other events, I'd like to read what Daniel Stein of Congregation B'nai Shalom sent out today. He writes, quote, "If there is a silver lining in yesterday's horrific events, it is that many of our elected officials seem to be joining together with a renewed sense of purpose and unity. I am also proudly grateful to the women and men who risk their lives on Wednesday and every day to protect our nation and our liberties. I remain optimistic that we will one day see the words of our prayer book fulfilled, that, quote, citizens of races and creeds will forge a common bond in true harmony to banish hatred and bigotry and to safeguard the free ideals and free institutions that are the pride and glory of our country," unquote. This evening's program is part of a four-part series, Sharing Dreams. The main sponsors are the East Bay International Jewish Film Festival, the Contra Costa Jewish Community Center and its Under 110 programming, and Congregation B'nai Tikva's Social Action Committee. Co-sponsors are Congregation B'nai Shalom, Congregation Beth Emek, Beth Haim Congregation, Diablo Valley Hadassah, J-Corps, Temple Beth Abraham, and Temple Isaiah. And the whole series is in memory of the former mayor of Hayward, Eileen Weinreb, who many of you may have heard of. She recently passed away, who was dedicated to social action and to civil liberties for all people. Our speaker today is, of course, the Fred in Around the World with Fred. Fred Rosenbaum. He is the founder and the former director of Lehr House Judaica in Berkeley, now called HaMakom, and built it up to become the largest Jewish adult education center in the entire Western United States. He grew up in Queens in a family that was marked by the Holocaust. His mother fled Poland and escaped to the United States. His father had emigrated from Poland years earlier. He earned a bachelor's degree at Washington University in St. Louis, and then studied the history of Nazi Germany as a Fulbright Fellow in West Germany. He earned a master's degree in European history at Cal. He's the author of many books. Let me see if I can, oh, sorry. I'm very bad with which direction. This book here there are no Sarahs. Taking Risks. These are books about partisans, and they're very good as an introduction for teenagers about the Holocaust. Out on a Ledge, one of my favorites, and also Cosmopolitans, which is about the Jews of the Bay Area. And now this will be recorded for people who have to leave in the middle or want to tell friends and relatives wherever they are in the world, actually, who have missed this presentation, where they can see it on our website. It will be both on eastbayjewishfilm.org and under110.org as well. And if you'd like to ask questions or make comments, please use the chat function, which is located at the bottom of your computer screen. Just tap it, and then you can type in questions for Fred. And now, Fred, thank you so much for being our scholar in residence for this entire year. We have more to come with Fred later on in the spring. And here you are, Fred Rosenbaum.
Okay, thank you, Reva, for arranging all this, and thank you, Nili, for the tech support. Now, I know it's hard to think of anything else now than the horrific events in Washington yesterday. So if anyone would like to bring up a question or a comment about that in one of the Q&A segments, please feel free to do so. As it turns out, there is a connection between tonight's talk and yesterday's storming of the US Capitol. Rabbi Joachim Prinz witnessed and bravely spoke out against the assault against democracy in the Weimar Republic. And that was also carried out by extremist right-wing insurgents. So I'm going to have some more detail on that later tonight, but actually in a certain way, this is timely. Now, the film shows how, like a Hebrew prophet, he denounced tyranny in Nazi Germany and later racism in America with the same zeal. The main theme is that these two are closely linked. His experience as a Jew in Hitler's Berlin was the impetus for his crusade for civil rights after he immigrated to the United States. After a visit to the state of Georgia in 1937, he said, "What is happening to the Black people in America," he meant the segregation and humiliation of Jim Crow, "is the very same thing that is happening to the Jews in Germany." Now, this was 5 years before the final solution. Again, he said this in 1937. But even so, it was a chilling analogy. The Third Reich and the American South. And the film captures his passion for social justice. However, it's only 50 minutes long, and I feel it glosses over and even omits key dimensions of his life. Moreover, it's hagiographical. That is, it lavishly praises the rabbi, but presents no critique of any of his decisions, policies, or character flaws. Among the interviewees who get the most time on screen are his 3 children, who all served on the documentary's 7-person advisory committee. Now, in fact, Prinz was criticized both for his provocative positions and his flamboyant style, criticized by several leading Jewish intellectuals, such as Milton Himmelfarb and Norman Podhoretz of Commentary magazine. Other Jewish voices took issue with his demand that in the wake of the Shoah, we devote ourselves to helping other minority groups. And these critics argued the opposite. They said, the world attempted and almost succeeded in destroying us. The world is a jungle, and defending ourselves here and abroad, that's the main imperative. Still others felt that the political activism that is associated with Prinz's career, that political activism is not that major a part of Jewish law, as Prinz claimed. Then there were other critics who argued that to equate the Black and Jewish oppression was tendentious, that they are not what Prinz said, the very same thing. So what I'd like to do this evening is flesh out the tumultuous life of this multifaceted, multi-talented, and highly controversial man who was born in a tiny Prussian village and went on to speak at one of the most momentous mass gatherings in American history. Now, I deeply admire him. he was one of the greatest Jewish leaders of the 20th century. And I agree with him more than with his detractors. But his life and work are much more complex than shown in the film. Now, how can we find out more about him? Can we have the first slide, please? Thank you. Now, he wrote a revealing full-length autobiography soon after his retirement in 1977. And there you see the title, Rebellious Rabbi. And that picture of Prinz, that's what he looked like when he was in Berlin in the late 20s and early 30s. Now, can we trust this memoir, though? I'm saying that the film was hagiographical. Somebody's own memoir might also be. Any memoir requires much fact-checking, not only because so much time has gone by that can blur memory, but also because it's human nature for the subject to present himself or herself in the best possible light. Fortunately, an eminent historian of German and American Jewry, Professor Michael A. Meyer, and you see his name at the bottom of the book cover. Professor Meyer appears in the film a couple of times. Meyer carefully annotated the book for errors and exaggeration, and he also wrote a thorough and insightful introduction. So this memoir that Prinz wrote, viewed through Meyer's lens, is an invaluable source. Now, let me repeat this. He entitled his book, Rebellious Rabbi. And I think this trait of confronting the establishment, breaking norms, shattering convention, that's the key to understanding him. He always relished the role of maverick, the enfant terrible. Okay, Nili, we can remove that slide of the book now. Thank you. Now, born in the Kaiser's Germany in 1902, he grew up loving his mother, who died 3 months before his bar mitzvah. But he despised his father. Now, I know that historians often make lousy psychiatrists, so I'm not going to try to psychoanalyze Joachim Prinz. But the facts about his family shed light on the fierce intergenerational conflict of German Jews in general in the early 20th century. Prinz's father, and now I'm getting this information from his autobiography. Prinz's father was a very wealthy, assimilated businessman who was cold, distant, and domineering, and carried himself like a Prussian aristocrat. He was conservative politically, a proud German patriot who downplayed Judaism, and he was an extreme anti-Zionist. That's the father. Prinz, by contrast, was outgoing, devoted to common people, very progressive politically, a severe critic of Germany, even in the 1920s. He made Judaism the cornerstone of his life, and he was also a staunch Zionist. So father and son were at sword's point on virtually everything. In one of the most telling vignettes in the autobiography, Prinz reveals that his father's only deathbed request was to extract a promise from his son that he would not become a rabbi. I promised, writes Prinz, with my fingers crossed behind my back, knowing I was lying. The son's bold, path-breaking life would be in defiance of his father's timidity and cowardice. And those words, according to Prinz himself. Now, although an ordained rabbi in Berlin by 1926, Prinz fully embraced what would later be called the counterculture, a social and cultural revolt of his age group against the straight-laced attitude and what you could call the bourgeois respectability of their parents. Berlin was even more freewheeling than is shown in the film. It reveled in nonconformism, with a lively gay scene, with American jazz, expressionist art, a daring theater, and free love, with an ethos similar to Greenwich Village in the 1950s and Berkeley and San Francisco in the 1960s. You get a feel of this bohemian, at times decadent life in the film Cabaret, starring Joel Grey. I think many of you are familiar with that. And Prinz says in his book, he was in cabarets every night. Now, one woman interviewed in the film recalls that the young charismatic rabbi was a rock star. Remember that line? Well, there's more to that than you might think. Prinz writes that he and his first and second wife in the 1920s decided to renounce monogamy and had several extramarital affairs. Now, normally, I wouldn't go into this private matter, but it's significant to see Prinz himself in his memoir openly discuss his multiple sexual relationships in the 1920s and 30s without a hint of self-reproach or even reflection. Professor Meyer, early in his introduction to the memoir, uses the word astounding about such intimate revelations in the autobiography of a famous rabbi. Now, no small part of the rebellion against the older generation was the Jewish revival, which Prinz exemplified. His parents and grandparents had sought emancipation, equal rights for Jews, and attained them, but otherwise had a very faint Jewish identity. Then, amidst the revolutionary upheaval following World War I, when every institution and belief was called into question, young people like Prinz and the philosopher and educator Franz Rosenzweig, they rejected what they saw as the hypocrisy of their elders, whom they accused of being Jewish in name only. And many of those sensitive, intelligent Jews who came of age in the 1920s, they aimed to create a full and meaningful Jewish life for the Jews of their generation. Prinz had to function, though, within a bureaucratic structure. Almost all of Berlin's rabbis worked for the Gemeinde, or community, an umbrella organization far more powerful than our federations. The Gemeinde not only provided social services, but also ran nearly all the synagogues and owned their buildings. They did not attach the rabbis to particular congregations, but rather rotated them throughout the capital. So Prinz led services and delivered powerful sermons at several of the magnificent temples. Let's see the next slide, Neely. His favorite temple was the Neue Synagogue. This had a 3,500 seat sanctuary. To give you some idea of that, that's twice the size of San Francisco's Emmanuel. And Prinz often filled it, largely with young people. He spoke without notes. He did not use a microphone. And there was a theatrical quality to his sermons in this majestic sanctuary. This was his stage. By the way, today, you can only see the facade. This thing miraculously survived Kristallnacht, but it was destroyed in the Allied bombings. But the facade is still there, and when I lead study tours to Berlin, of course, I take the group there, and there are rooms inside, and we even have Shabbat services inside. Okay, we can remove that slide now. Thank you. Now, Prinz stressed 2 points in these captivating sermons and other speeches. From 1926 until he departed in mid-1937. So he left well over a year before Kristallnacht. First and foremost, he implored his listeners to get out. There is no future for a Jew in Germany. He thundered even before Hitler. In fact, he gave up completely on the land of his birth as early as 1922, while he was still a seminary student. This was due to the assassination of the Jewish foreign minister of the Weimar Republic, Walter Rathenau, assassinated by proto-Nazis. There had been months of incitement, chants of Rathenau Judensau, Rathenau Jewish pig. And then he was gunned down on the way to the Foreign Office. And Prinz also saw far-right extremists try to storm the Reichstag in 1920, as early as that. He also witnessed Hitler's failed beer hall putsch. Putsch is the German word for coup d'etat. And that was in Munich in 1923. Still, it was unusual for a German Jew to reject his country that early. But in this regard, Prinz was the exception, as he so often would be. As you know, most people thought Hitler was a madman leading a fringe group. As late as 1928, the Nazi Party had only 12 seats in the 660-member Reichstag. Only 12 seats. 4 years later, it was the largest party and came to power. Exactly what Prinz had anticipated. And his shrill warning was desperately needed. Only 2/5 of German Jewry left before Kristallnacht, November 38. The others refused to separate themselves from their cherished German culture. Or, with wishful thinking, they felt Hitler would soon fall from power. Or they were loath to give up their professions. In Berlin, Jews were only 4% of the population. They were 43% of all the attorneys. Now, I am currently, but just by coincidence, I'm currently co-authoring the memoir of a Berlin Jew who said that to this day, he constantly agonizes over why his family did not leave. He survived in hiding, but his parents and sister were abducted from their home and murdered in Auschwitz. He said his father, a prominent attorney, would always close down the family conversation about immigration with the words, "I'm a lawyer here. In New York, I would be a dishwasher." And let's keep in mind that the Shoah was unprecedented. They had no idea something like this could happen. As one historian says, German Jews could accept the worst, but not the unthinkable. Prinz, though, saw through the delusions and rationalizations, and he could imagine the unthinkable. Now, it's impossible to say for how many Berlin Jews he was the tipping point in their decision to immigrate. You know, in the film, his son says thousands. I don't know how he can know that. But there is no question that his alarm bell saved numerous lives, if only more had heeded him. Now, if the first theme of his sermons was "Get out now," the second theme was "Make Aliyah." He was an avid Zionist, even in the 1920s, when that was considered absurd by the overwhelming majority of German Jews. He believed that whether they recognized it or not, Jews were a separate people, a nation apart from Germany, and they needed and deserved a homeland in Palestine. He saw his mission as providing his beleaguered community pride and knowledge about their heritage. As the film shows, Jews were demonized in the newspapers and on radio, just as they were discriminated against with the punitive legislation, such as the Nuremberg laws of 1935, stripping them of citizenship. So in his sermons and in his 8 books, including some children's books that he wrote in only 4 years, an incredible output, he vividly described the glories of Jewish civilization from ancient times to the present. So more than prayers, he used the heroes of history to raise his people's spirits. Now, the man I'm currently writing about was a teenager when he heard Prinz at the Neue Synagogue, and he heard several other young, dynamic Berlin rabbis. He told me they gave him sorely needed moral support at a time when young Jews were kicked out of the public schools, barred from German youth groups, taunted by Nazi bullies on the streets. But Prinz's German rabbinate came to an end in 1935, 2 years before he immigrated, because he was summarily fired by the Gemeinde, the umbrella organization I mentioned earlier. Clearly, they were unhappy with his loose lifestyle, and more so with his repudiation of Germany and his advocacy of Zionism, both still minority opinions among Jews and considered dangerous by the establishment. But according to Professor Meyer's research, there was another reason as well for them to dismiss Prinz. He was frequently taking long vacations in resorts in Switzerland. In any case, in early 1937, he and his pregnant wife and 2 children immigrated to the United States. He was sponsored by the leading rabbi of America, the progressive Stephen Wise, who you see in the film. He had met Wise at an international conference, and Stephen Wise would be his mentor. Now, Prinz claims in his autobiography, and the film repeats, that he was expelled by the Gestapo. Professor Meyer says he's not sure why this would happen, because expulsion was actually too mild a method for the Nazis. Rather, they beat, tortured, imprisoned dissidents. Maybe Prinz means that in effect he was expelled because they made it clear to him that if he persisted with his speeches and writing, they would send him to a concentration camp for political prisoners, and several of them were already functioning. But it might have been that he simply wanted to immigrate to save his and his family's lives. After all, he was himself predicting total destruction. And I would not fault him in the slightest for that. But if that were the case, some might say that he was abandoning the Jewish community just when it needed him the most. By contrast, the esteemed Berlin rabbi Leo Beck, a generation older than Prinz, remained to serve German Jewry all the way until 1943, when he was sent to Theresienstadt. Thankfully, Rabbi Beck survived. So Prinz left relatively early. But the next question is, why did this steadfast Zionist, always urging Aliyah, himself, why did he choose America? Obviously, it would have been a much harder life for him in Palestine. And he was someone used to luxury because of his father's great wealth. Also, he spoke English far better than Hebrew. And that's vital for someone who made his living through public speaking. But more important, Prinz and several other German rabbis in the liberal denomination, that was his denomination, it's called liberal. It's somewhere between, it's something, the liberal in Germany, the liberal denomination was something like conservative Judaism in the United States. And Prinz and the other liberal rabbis, they knew they could not practice their profession in the Holy Land, which was dominated by Orthodox who wouldn't even recognize them as rabbis. In the US, they could lead Reform or conservative congregations. Yet he had trouble finding work in New York, still not fully recovered from the Depression. And he was in bad, even desperate financial straits for 2 years because he had been such a profligate spender in Berlin. He was also disappointed in America due to the suffering he saw in impoverished Black ghettos such as Harlem. American Jewry he deemed mediocre in every respect and blind to the Nazi threat. So this early period in the States was the worst time in his entire life. Then, in 1939, Stephen Wise found him a job as rabbi of Temple B'nai Abraham in Newark, New Jersey. And now we see yet another exceptional facet to his career. He masterfully revived a dying congregation and would remain there for almost 40 years until his retirement from this demanding post at the age of 75. In these decades, he would also gain national prominence. Now, I'd like to pause here And this can be our first Q&A session. I've spoken almost exclusively about the Berlin years, but let's see whatever is on your mind. We can take some questions now. And
So
then
I
we'll,
just,
go
I
ahead.
just wanted, I wanted to just say that Joachim was my uncle.
Oh, boy.
Yeah.
I hope I didn't reveal too many secrets.
Well, there are some things I wouldn't say I knew from the family or I know differently. So I'm not gonna, but yeah, he's my father's brother. And I am in close contact with my cousins, Jonathan and Lucy. And yeah, so if anyone has a question I can answer, I can do that.
Well, let me ask you a question.
He married my husband and I, and my parents only were able to leave Germany because Joachim got them out, and
Yes.
my parents lived there in New Jersey with them for about almost a year.
Right, well, both of his brothers got out, I know that. But let me ask you a question. Have you read the autobiography?
Yeah, I have it here, yeah.
Oh, okay, good. All right,
And
that
so
will really reveal Joachim Prinz.
Yeah, no, my mother was still alive when that book came out, and she said there were things in there she didn't agree with or no, but I've never actually asked my cousin, so that I don't know exactly. But he, the thing about my grandfather being wealthy in Oppeln in Germany,
Yes.
there, that I never heard. I mean, I have pictures of the house but I never heard they were really wealthy. I know he was a merchant. But some of the things you said, I've heard, of course, and the fact that he was expelled from Germany, we always were told.
Yeah, I know that, and it's repeated in the film, but Professor Meyer doubts it, and they, like I said in my talk, expulsion was in a way too mild for the Nazis. They didn't just say, oh, you have to leave the country, On the other hand, he may have been intimidated. They may have said, if you persist in this, you're going to Dachau, So it's one or the other. I think if he decided to immigrate just to save himself and his family, I cannot fault him for that. That's completely understandable. But he might have done that, but said he was being expelled.
It was Stephen Weiss who got him.
Yeah,
out.
absolutely.
I'll have to ask my cousins, but I was an interviewer for the Shoah Foundation for some years, and I always use my maiden name. So whenever I saw a German survivor, and that was all over the country, I never had a German survivor who didn't look at my name and say, if it weren't for, who was in Berlin, if it weren't for your uncle, I wouldn't have made it out. Every single time I heard that, just like in the movie, they look at me and say.
Okay, thank you, Susan. That's wonderful that we could have you contribute to the conversation like that.
Yeah, I won't take up time. I'll just listen now.
Okay, okay. Riva, is there another question or two?
How old was he when his father died?
Well, what happened was I said that the father had a deathbed request, remember? That he not be a rabbi, but the father was a bit of a hypochondriac and actually survived that episode. And the father did not die until 1954. Am I right, Susan?
One of the other brother, and the father and the stepmother moved left for Palestine, yeah, and that's where the father died. Yeah,
1954. Yeah. Okay. Was there another question?
The only other question was, if he didn't want to go to Palestine because he couldn't be an active rabbi, where else besides historically could Jews easily go besides the United States if you were lucky at that time?
Right. Well, first of all, things were a little better if you had German nationality, if you wanted to come to the States that early. because I think, as most of you know, in 1924, Congress passed these immigration laws that had very low quotas for Eastern Europe and Italy, but very high quotas for Germany and Britain. You know, it was a racist view in which they looked at all this. So if you had money and you had someone in the States to sponsor you, and Stephen Wise, of course, you know, a celebrity, it wasn't that hard actually at that point to come to the United States. It would become harder as time went on. After Kristallnacht in November 38, there was a desperate rush for people to get out. 100,000 German Jews, a fifth of the whole community, emigrated just in the year following Kristallnacht. And after that, it really started to be more difficult. As you know, about 15 or 20,000 went to Shanghai under Japanese control. And then in 1941, the Germans closed the borders. And it was especially difficult in Berlin. They wanted to make Berlin Judenfrei, free of the Jews. And so every Jew was there illegally. That's why the person I'm writing about went into hiding. And about 6,000 of them went into hiding. About a quarter of that group survived the war. Okay.
I think we should continue.
Yeah. Another question?
No, I don't have it.
Oh, okay. So let's go to part two. We'll have another opportunity for questions after. I want to get to the United States and the civil rights. So typical of Prinz, as urgently as he needed work in 1939, he would not take the Newark pulpit without a guarantee of complete freedom to speak his mind. The synagogue was in the conservative movement. Prinz introduced many changes in the direction of Reform Judaism. Unlike in Germany, he did not keep kosher and he was not Shomer Shabbos. Yet he insisted that the congregation not join the Reform movement or any denomination, but remain completely independent. Very typical of this independent spirit of Joachim Prinz. Now, B'nai Abraham had a grandiose Greek revival synagogue with a sanctuary for 2,000. This had been constructed during a period of prosperity in 1924 in a fashionable Jewish neighborhood, but it had fallen on hard times in the 1930s. And now it had a dwindling membership, a large debt, and a high overhead. Prinz, by the force of his magnetic personality, drew huge crowds for services, many of whom joined the congregation, and its rolls soared. He was one of a number of young German Jewish rabbis who had immigrated to America from Nazi Germany, and they made a major impact. Examples in San Francisco would be Rabbi Joseph Asher at Emmanuel, and Rabbi Ted Alexander at B'nai Emunah in the Sunset. Maybe some of you knew him. Now, in addition to his inspiring sermons, Prinz excelled in pastoral work, youth and adult education, and cultural programming. And I find this remarkable for a rabbi who would soon enjoy such a high national profile. Within a decade, B'nai Abraham became the most vibrant synagogue in New Jersey. There is no question that he gave Jews a sense of self-respect and confidence in the turbulent 1940s. And for that reason, he is a fictional character with his real name in Philip Roth's celebrated novel, The Plot Against America. Neely, could we see the next slide? Now, Perhaps the story is familiar to you. Last year, by the way, it was made into an HBO series, which I highly recommend. Now, this is a counterfactual narrative. That is to say, Roth imagines something happening in history that didn't happen. And it is that the wildly popular anti-Semite Charles Lindbergh wins the GOP nomination for president in 1940, and he goes on to defeat FDR. A wave of violent Jew hatred ensues, and all of this is set in Newark, New Jersey, Roth's hometown. And Roth presents Rabbi Prinz vehemently denouncing Lindbergh from the pulpit and in the press, which Prinz did in real life. But then the author invents a repellent character, the opportunistic Rabbi Lionel Bengelsdorf, who, out of a misplaced sense of American patriotism, urges Jews to support Lindbergh. And he makes light of the attacks waged against the Jews by Nazi thugs. So in the novel, Roth has Prinz, alone among the other rabbis in town, take on the famous aviator, now president, Lindbergh, and his toady, Rabbi Bengelsdorf. Can you scroll down in this slide to the next image? That's it. Now, this is from the HBO TV series. You see on the right is this Rabbi Bengelsdorf, who's for Lindbergh, and that's played by John Turturro. On the left is Rabbi Prinz in the TV series, again with his real name, and he's played by the actor Ethan Hirschenfeld. Now, this particular photo is taken, it was not from the actual movie, because in the movie, these two are at odds. But it was behind the scenes where these two actors liked each other. So there you see on the left, the actor playing Rabbi Joachim Prinz. Okay, we can remove that slide now, Neely, thank you. Now, in the novel, Roth imagines Prinz forming a committee of civic leaders to protect the Jews. And then Roth envisions Rabbi Prinz creating another level of protection. Could we see the next slide? Okay. Now, the other level of protection is that Prinz, in the novel, enlists New Jersey's most notorious mobster, Longy Zwillman. He's known as Longy because he's over 6 feet tall, and that was unusual among the Jews of Newark at that time. This guy was a bootlegger and the founder of Murder Incorporated. And in the novel, Prinz enlists Zwillman to make any Newark Nazi an offer he can't refuse. Now, in real life, Prinz was Zwillman's neighbor and close friend. This is a person from real life, Longy Zwillman. And he was Prinz's neighbor and close friend. And Prinz officiated at the gangster's funeral in 1959. Prinz received thousands of dollars from Zwillman to dispense his charity. He even performed the wedding of Zwillman's trigger man. Now, I'm talking about real life now. I'm not talking about the novel anymore. Prinz recounts that the hitman, Longy Zwillman's hitman, was a Kohen of the priestly class, and thus by Jewish law not allowed to marry his bride because she was a divorcee. The rabbi concluded, though, that due to the groom's horrid record of criminality, he could no longer be considered a Kohen, and thus Prinz went ahead with the wedding. Okay, we can remove that slide. Thank you. Now, all of this is yet another example of Prinz as a rabbi like no other. Audacious, irreverent, crossing boundaries, and yet greatly admired. By the way, Prinz and Philip Roth were longtime friends. Perhaps reflecting his unrestrained views about sex, Prinz was one of the very few rabbis to praise Roth's work, including Portnoy's complaint. And Prinz is the only rabbi in all of Roth's voluminous writings to be portrayed in a positive light. The only rabbi. Now, Prinz, of course, was known far beyond Newark, and I now turn to his role as a civil rights activist. This is the centerpiece of the film. He led picketing outside Woolworth's in Manhattan because the retail chain had segregated lunch counters in the South. He wrote and circulated petitions decrying redlining and discrimination in housing and banking. He took Southern politicians to task for their racist attitudes and policies. As in Berlin, his sermons invariably dealt with political issues, and he held nothing back. On the Shabbat before the 1964 presidential election, he declared, "A Jewish vote for Barry Goldwater is a vote for Jewish suicide," and that the GOP candidate was, quote, "surrounded by every hate group and every anti-Semite in America." Prinz was sharply criticized for that by many mainstream Jewish groups that supported Lyndon Johnson, but opposed such language as unduly alarmist and vitriolic. Now, Prinz was already widely known as president of the American Jewish Congress. This is a post he held for 2 terms from 1958 to 1966, the most critical years for race relations since Reconstruction. The AJ Congress, although it has declined in recent decades, was powerful in this civil rights era. And it was the most progressive Jewish organization in the country. Rabbi Stephen Wise and Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis were among the founders back in 1918. Joachim Prinz was president when much was accomplished. And it was in that capacity that he was invited to speak immediately before Dr. King at the momentous March on Washington in 1963. Prinz's brief but very moving speech is shown in its entirety in the film. So I'm not going to go into the whole thing, but I would like to highlight just one section that encapsulates Prinz's rabbinate and his life. If we could have the next slide. Now let's look at the first line. When I was the rabbi of the Jewish community in Berlin under the Hitler regime, I learned many things. Let's focus on just the phrasing there. When I was the rabbi of the Jewish community. Now, this is but one example of the embellishment and exaggeration I was referring to, which Professor Meyer corrects with footnotes on almost every page of the autobiography. Forgive me for being such a nitpicker, but he was not the rabbi of the Berlin Jewish community under Nazism. For the first 2 years of the regime, he was one of dozens of community rabbis, some old, some young, some dynamic and inspirational, some not. They served a Jewish population of 160,000 in Berlin. If you didn't know that, you'd think he was like the chief rabbi or the only rabbi in Berlin. But I forgive him this self-aggrandizement. I forgive him. Why? Because of the wisdom and eloquence that follows. Let's look at what he says. The most important thing I learned under those tragic circumstances was that bigotry and hatred are not the most urgent problem. The most urgent, the most disgraceful, the most shameful, and the most tragic is silence. A great people which had created a great civilization had become a nation of silent onlookers. They remain silent in the face of hate, in the face of brutality, and in the face of mass murder. America must not become a nation of onlookers. America must not remain silent. I think that's the real heart of his speech. Okay, we can remove that slide, Nilly, thank you. Now, while he was known primarily for that oration, in between a stirring song of Mahalia Jackson, Queen of Gospel, and the I Have a Dream speech by Martin Luther King, he's known for that, but he did much more. Prinz was the first rabbi in the country to reach out to King as early as 1958 and invited him to give the keynote address at his inauguration as president of the AJ Congress. He later brought King to speak at Temple B'nai Abraham. But now we get to more controversial issues. And you know, the film pretty much ends with the civil rights in the mid-60s, and you don't get anything after that. Prinz is in his post until 1977. Now, what are these controversial issues? Well, during his tenure, the AJ Congress was the only Jewish group to come out not only for affirmative action, but also minimum quotas for Blacks. There had to be a specific minimum number of Blacks at universities and in other posts. The organization under Prinz's tenure was sympathetic to the Black Muslims. They actually went to court to defend the right of Muslim prisoners to wear religious symbols and clothing. The AJ Congress even held that the Nation of Islam, despite inflammatory statements by its leaders like Elijah Muhammad, that the Nation of Islam was not fundamentally anti-Semitic. And when the race riots erupted in the mid-1960s, Prinz characterized the violence and looting as a, quote, cry of frustration and desperation of a people who had been oppressed. Now, it's remarkable that with such contentious left-leaning views, he was elected in 1965 for a 2-year term as the chair of the Conference of Presidents of Major Jewish Organizations. The large majority of the 51 organizations did not agree with his positions, and many did not appreciate his aggressive style. So this was a tribute to his gravitas and his eloquence. He was almost a latter-day Stephen Wise. Now, you know the expression, I think most of you have heard this, A conservative is a liberal who has been mugged. But that turnabout never happened to Rabbi Prinz, even though he was the victim of violent crime in Newark several times. He writes that once a black cab driver held him up and he said, "I marched with Dr. King." The thief replied, "I don't care who your doctor is, just give me your goddamn money." Prinz was even the victim of extortion by the Black Panthers. Regardless of his record on civil rights, I don't know if they knew it or not, they wanted to shake him down for $5,000, and they actually kidnapped the synagogue's custodian to force him to reveal Prinz's home address. Fortunately, the employee refused and was released unharmed. Now, all the other major congregations in Newark moved out to the suburbs in the mid and late 1960s. It was a classic case of white flight. And this is mentioned in the film. Crime and poverty surged in the inner city, often affecting Jewish neighborhoods. In 1967, Newark endured disastrous race riots, among the worst in the whole country, leaving 26 dead. I wanted to show you a film clip of those race riots in Newark, just to give you an idea of the scale of this. Nili, could we have the film clip?
Newark, New Jersey became a city of race riots, violence, looting, and hate. For 5 days, it was a battleground and a looter's paradise. Colored citizens clashed with police, National Guardsmen, and state troopers. 24 people were killed and 1,200 injured. Nearly half the city was in the grip of terror. The Newark flare-ups sparked similar riots in other American centers, with hatred near danger point between white and black extremist groups. In Newark, there was an uneasy tension, punctuated by minor outbreaks of violence after 5 days of bloody fighting. From rooftops and windows, snipers picked their targets. The toll of dead and injured tells its own tragic story. Damage runs into millions of dollars. With the coming of the long, hot summers, for 3 years, America has had to face the tragic consequences of riots stemming from the slums of cities stretching right across the nation. Negroes claim they have waited long enough for equal rights. Militant leaders of some urge violence as the answer. This was one example.
Okay, thank you, Nili. That, by the way, that was not far from the temple. That was not far from B'nai Abraham. Now, within months after these disastrous riots in 1967, the rival synagogue to B'nai Abraham, the large, affluent B'nai Jeshurun, they moved out of Newark to the upscale suburb of Short Hills, New Jersey. By the early 70s, not one of the 1,000 families of Prinz's temple B'nai Abraham, not one lived within the city limits of Newark. But he insisted on holding on. Although finally, the congregation moved to the upscale suburb of Livingston in 1973, and its historic building reverted to a Pentecostal church, which you see in the film. Now, even in the midst of all this, Prinz never stopped imploring Jews to do more for African Americans. Even when Black-Jewish relations were necessarily undergoing a rethinking in light of the Black Power movement. as you all know, Reverend King, whose aim was integration through nonviolent methods, was assassinated in 1968, and new leaders like Stokely Carmichael, Bobby Seale, Huey Newton, they had different goals and different tactics in mind. And that repelled many, including many Jews. Prinz would not let the Jews off the hook. In 1970, he gave a blistering speech before the Rabbinical Assembly. That's the International Organization of Conservative Rabbis, 250 of whom were present. He bewailed the retreat of Jews from Black causes, and then he stung the audience with the claim, I'm quoting now, Jews are among the most bigoted people in the world, and the rabbis have followed their ranks, unquote. That's a really extreme statement, and it's almost meant to upset and disturb people. He wanted us to be the best we could be, but sometimes his rhetoric was over the top. Yet his own career in America refutes his scathing critique of Jewish moral and intellectual failings. Joachim Prinz, despite his iconoclasm, his sharp tongue, his self-absorption, despite all that, he not only flourished, but became a revered and accomplished national Jewish leader. We benefited greatly from his noble vision and his tireless efforts to bring it about. So the rebellious rabbi is himself testimony to the depth and breadth of American Jewry. Thank you. Okay, so, thank you. So I think we still have time for some questions.
Yes, we do. I'd like people to, well, there was one question which I didn't catch. I don't see any new ones, but the other question is, why isn't he better known? There are other rabbis like Wise and some others.
Yeah, I'll explain. That's a darn good question. First of all, let's think of this. He made that speech. That's what he is known for, by the way, is the speech. He is known for that. You know, there are two really outstanding, exhaustive biographies of King. One of them is a 3-volume biography by Taylor Branch. The other is a 1,000-page biography by David Garrow. So I looked him up in both of those biographies. They only each mentions him only one time as giving the speech before the the King had the dream speech. And why is that? Well, he did not go down to the South and march in the South like some other rabbis did. You
don't mention Heschel's name.
Pardon me? What was that?
That's Stephen Lamb.
What did you say, Stephen?
Well, yeah, I had asked the question why we grew up learning so much of Abraham Joshua Heschel and King, but not about Joachim Prinz and King.
Well, that's what I'm explaining.
Yes.
That Heschel was arm in arm with Martin Luther King at the famous march between Selma and Montgomery. And, and Heschel made that famous statement, I felt like I was praying with my feet, Other rabbis went to the South, from the North, went to the South. In the Bay Area, 5 rabbis went on that march. They went from the Bay Area down to the South to march there. He didn't do that. And I'm not faulting him for any of this. I'm just saying that's one reason he's not as well known. And I'll tell you, in terms of courage, I feel that the rabbis in the South should be better known, and that they were the ones who really stuck their neck out because they were hounded by the Ku Klux Klan. And, someone like Rabbi Jacob Rothschild in Atlanta, who spoke out so forcefully, and they bombed his synagogue and the Klan. And the same thing in Jackson, Mississippi, where they bombed the synagogue. So the rabbis in the South, I think, who really put themselves on the line, I think they're deserving of a little more, deserving to be better known. As for Prinz, there were other German rabbis, as German Jews who, immigrated and were rabbis. And he's known for the speech,
I would add that one of the rabbis from the Bay Area
Yes.
was Joe Weinberg, who later became the head at Washington Hebrew Congregation.
Yes, that's right. He was one of them. Another one was the scholar Jacob Milgram. Maybe some of you remember him, UC Berkeley. Another one was Rabbi David Teitelbaum, who, was in Redwood City at Beth Jacob. Another one was the Hillel director at Berkeley, Paul Lederman. So these rabbis went to the South and marched.
Berman. Don't
Pardon
leave
me?
out Saul Berman.
I don't know. I would have to.
I do know.
Oh, he did? He's the
I
one,
was
the
there.
fifth one? Is he the fifth one?
Yes,
Okay, then thank you for that.
you're welcome.
It's, I had a senior moment there and couldn't think of the fifth Bay Area one.
Are there any more?
Anyway, you get the idea though. That's of a different order. But again, especially the rabbis in the South. Yeah, Riva, I think you had something.
Someone asked, why didn't he go to the South and become more active with his feet, so to speak?
Well, look, I can't fault him for that. He was doing his part. There's no question. I gave you many examples. Inviting King to the temple. That was a big thing in 1958. And there were some people within the B'nai Abraham. I mean, he was very, very beloved. But there were some people who thought he was going too far on these things. Even a rabbi like him had to deal with a board of directors of the temple, but he stuck to his guns on that. And as we say, with the American Jewish Congress, he was taking, very progressive stands on Black Jewish relations. I think he really stands out during the Black Power period, when so many Jews did a rethinking about this, but as I mentioned, Prinz would not let the Jews off the hook on that, even in the midst of changing Black consciousness in the early 70s.
Are there any more questions? Fred, thank you again.
Sure.
This is being recorded, so for those who had to leave early, who of course are not here, but you can remind them or your friends and family, you can go to eastbayjewishfilm.org and under110.org, and you can see the recording. Everyone be safe, wear a mask, and to health and peace in our country.
Thank
Thank you, Fred. Thank you, Fred.
Well,
Thank you,
Fred.
Thank you, Fred.
yes, I appreciated also the questions, contributions made. Thank you.
Fred.
Bye-bye.
That was good. I'm glad we saw it.
Oh, yeah.